This is the Gemarah in Sanhedrin, Daf Chav Zayin Amud Aleph, about Eid Zomem. And here the Gemarah says, Eid Zomem, a witness who's found to be a Zomem is invalidated from future testimony because of the fact that we know that he testified falsely. But the following is the Machlokes. Abaye Amar Lemafreya hu nifsal. Abaye says that he becomes invalidated retroactively. So Rashi explains, Heyid ben Nisan, let's say he testified at first in Nisan, v'huzam b'tishrei, and in Tishrei, 6 months later, he is found to be a Zomem, al Eiduzu, about this testimony. Lemafreya, kol Eidio sheheyid min Nisan ve'elech psulim. All testimony that he gave between Nisan and Tishrei are retroactively invalidated. Sharei misheheyid Eiduzu hu Rasha. The status of Rasha, which invalidates a witness, began in Nisan. If he testified in Nisan on a certain event, and then it comes Tishrei 6 months later, Levi and Yehuda come and say that Reuven and Shimon were lying in Nisan, and we believe Levi and Yehuda. At this point in Tishrei, Reuven and Shimon will be punished for Kasher Zomem, and retroactively, any testimony given in this whole 6 month period, retroactively we have to undo the case or undo the transactions that were made based on their testimony, because they really became puzzle. They became invalid by the sin of testifying falsely in Nisan. That's logical. Abaye Amar Lemafrehu Nifsal, he is invalidated retroactively from the moment that he did the act that caused his invalidation. Rava Amar Nikan Ulahabahu Nifsal. Rava says that he is invalidated only going forward from Tishrei and on. But everything between Nisan and Tishrei are accepted because they were already accepted. Then the Gemara goes on to give the reasons. Abaye Amar Lemafreyahu Nifsal. Abaye says it's retroactive. Me idna de asid rashahu. From the moment that he testified in Nisan, he did the act which rendered him a Rasha for the purposes of Eidus. Ve'atorah amra al tashsesh Rasha Eid. Yadcha im Rasha, which is interpreted al tashes Rasha Eid. A Rasha shouldn't be a witness. So the cause of his invalidation is the act in Nisan. From that moment on, he is invalid. Rava Amar Mikanu lahabahu nifsal. Rava says he is invalidated only from this point forward. Why? Eid Zomem chidushu. The whole institution of Eid Zomem is a chiddush. A chiddush is something, a law, which contradicts the principles of the general principles of the Torah. So Eid Zomem is a chiddush. My chazis de samchas ahani smocha hani. Really, every case of Eid Zomem is completely contrary to the general principles of logic and of halacha, that if you have two witnesses testifying contradicted by two other witnesses, it seems like it should be a tie. My chazis de samchas ahani, why do you trust the second ones over the first ones? We believe the second ones, they are kosher, and the first ones are punished and are invalidated. So since there's no real logic to the law of Eid Zomem, we follow it because the Torah says so, like a chok. But ein lecha bo ela mishas chidusho ve'elech. We will only follow the law from the moment that the chiddush is introduced, which is in Tishrei. We minimize the extent of the chiddush. Like Rashi explained, chiddush shushan nifsalim shnayim b'shvil shnayim she'omrim imanu ha'isem. It's a chiddush to invalidate the first two because the second two just claim that you were with us. Why should you follow one group over the other? It's just a decree of the Torah. Therefore, we only follow it from this point on, from the moment that they're huzam. The concept of chiddush in respect to Eid Zomem really brings us back, and Tosfos will elaborate on this soon, but it brings us back to the general concept of hachasha. You see, we learned that when you have two pairs of witnesses whose testimonies contradict each other, that's called a tie. It's 2 versus 2. And the Gemarah Bava Basra describes or debates what to do in the case of a tie, and Rav Huna and Rav Chisda debate it, whether you follow Cheskas Kashrus or Cheskas Mamon. But in either event, they're considered to be a tie. However, there's another kind of conflict among witnesses, which is where, let's say 2 witnesses come and testify about an event, and then 2 other witnesses come and say that the first 2 are invalid because I saw them stealing money. Anyone who steals money is invalid. Reuven and Shimon come to testify about a case, and Levi and Yehuda say that Reuven and Shimon are thieves. In this case, the law and the logic is that we believe the second pair of witnesses, Levi and Yehuda, because this is really a case of 2 versus 0. Because there's 2 witnesses testifying against the character of Reuven and Shimon, and none to their defense. Reuven and Shimon are not witnesses on themselves. So therefore, the logic here is 2 versus 0. As opposed to Hachasha, where all 4 witnesses are testifying about a certain event. No one's testifying about each other. This is a 2 versus 2 tie. The case of Eid Zomem is a little bit like both, because on the one hand, the second 2 are testifying about the whereabouts of the first 2. At the same time, they're not testifying about the character or the sins of the first 2 witnesses. They're testifying about their ability to testify in the case because of their questionable whereabouts during the time that they saw the actual event. So here the logic goes as follows, that if you conceptually compare Eid Zomem to Hachasha, that they're not testifying about each other, but they're rather 4 witnesses testifying about the case. So really it is a 2 versus 2 tie, and it should have been the same as Hachasha. It should have been a draw. But nevertheless, the Torah says we believe the second over the first. That's called a chiddush. It's not consistent with the logic of the Torah. However, if you conceptually perceive Eid Zomem as similar to Gazlanusa, where you're testifying about the first witnesses, and the first witnesses can't testify about themselves, then it's actually logical or understandable to consider Eid Zomem like Gazlanusa and to follow the second ones over the first. It doesn't mean that you would have known it by yourself, but you can understand that the law of Eid Zomem is a mitzvah which fits into a category that's logical and consistent with the Torah's laws. But if you perceive the Eid Zomem as comparable to Achasha, and it really should have been a tie, then it would be a Chiddush HaTorah that the second Eidim, the Mazimim are believed, and the Zomim are not believed, which would not be the case in the case of Achasha. So this is a background as to why one may or may not perceive Eid Zomim as a Chiddush. In any event, the Gemarah suggests that the reason for Rava of limiting the law of Eid Zomim is because it's a Chiddush. My chazit to samchos ahani smoch ahani. Therefore, ein lecha bo elam yishas chidusho ve'elech. Presumably, Abaye does not think it's a chiddush. Ika da'amri. Others explain differently. Rava nami ka Abaye svirale. That Rava really agrees with Abaye that it's not a chiddush. There's no reason to limit the law of Eid Zomim. But Rava has a different reason to begin the invalidation from Tishrei instead of the more intuitive Nisan. My ta'am ka'amar mikan al haba mishum seided al kuchos. The reason why Rava limits the law of Eid Zomim is not conceptual, but it's practical. Since until Tishrei there was no reason to assume that Reuven and Shimon were puzzle, and they testified maybe many times, and people bought land and used them as the witnesses in the case which affected the contract. And later on we'll find out that they're invalid and retroactively undermine all the things they did in the meantime. That would be completely impractical, and the innocent people who relied on their testimony, people who bought land, let's say, based on their trusting them as witnesses, will lose money. Therefore, Rava limits it midrabanan only from Tishrei. My Beinayu, what is a nafkamina? What is the practical difference as to which reason of Rava you follow? Ika Beinayu, there is a difference. Da'ashidu beitrei bechad. Let's say the testimony of the second was, instead of being 2 against 2, it would be 2 versus 1. In which case, it's not a chiddush that we follow the second witnesses because of the fact that 2 witnesses are always stronger than 1 witness. Inami, alternatively, or similarly, the paslinu begazlanusa, the case of paslinu begazlanusa, that if you think that Rava is based on the practical concern of Seder Lekuchos, it will apply even when it's not a chiddush. Even when it's 2 versus 1, even in the case of Gazlanusa, it will be only pasul mikan al haba. But if you think that the reason for Rava is because of chiddush, then he will only limit the psul to mikan al haba when it is a chiddush. But when it's not a chiddush, like Gazlanusa or Trei Bechad, when there's good reason to believe the second witnesses, and we really establish as a matter of fact that the first witnesses were lying in Nisan, then he would invalidate them from Nisan. So in summary, in the case of Eid Zomem, we have Abaye and Rava debating. Abaye thinks that Pasulam Afreya because he's a Rasha from the time they testified. Rava thinks he's invalidated only going forward, either because of this idea of Chiddush, or because of the concept of Seder Lekuchot. And the nafkamina, as to which reason he follows, is the cases of Paslina Begazlanusa and Asiu do Trei Bechad and Trei Bechad. In both cases, there's no Chiddush. So if you follow the Chiddush reason, Rava will agree to Abaye that it's from Afreya. But if you think the reason is because of Seder Lekuchos, Rava's concept of Mikan al-Haba will extend even here, even though there's no Chiddush, because there still is a Seder Lekuchos.